Okay, today we are finally going to be assembling the Prusa MK3S Plus that I purchased a few months ago. It's ready, so let's take a look. So the first couple pages of the manual, let's grab our tools that are displayed here, pull them out, and get them ready for work. We'll take a look at the Y-axis assembly. That is the first step. We'll grab all of our pieces that we need, open up our boxes, and get our parts out. Get a little bit organized so that we can follow along the instructions. So we'll get our Y-axis parts bag there, get the parts that we need. We'll open up the flat box here for the frame of the printer. Make sure that the yellow sticker is facing up like the instructions say. And we'll get our screws out. Now it's very important here that you do read the instructions very thoroughly and very carefully, because they are done very well, and they're done very well for a reason. The assembly process is pretty complicated, but as long as you're following the steps in the manual here, you should be fine. Make sure you read the steps before you take action. So we're going to line up our frame, and we are going to put the screws into our extruded aluminum legs here to keep the frame standing. Tighten everything up. We're going to spin the frame around, and we'll attach the shorter legs to the other side. And a lot of these parts where I'm tightening up bolts and nuts, we will put in fast forward. All right, that's complete. The next step, we're going to attach the ends of the frame to the extruded aluminum legs, as these will add a lot of support and rigidity to the frame. They're pretty important. So let's get those pieces. We'll take a look. There's two different pieces. One's longer, one's shorter, and they can really only be attached one way properly. So let's get that done. We'll tighten them in. Now, if you read ahead in the manual, it does say do not tighten these fully. So you might see me loosen a couple of these just to make sure that they're not fully tightened, because we want to be able to balance the aluminum extruded legs so that the frame isn't wobbling on a flat surface. So before we tighten on the other end for the short side, we'll grab these two pieces here. They're used to mount some pieces later on in the assembly to the frame. They are important. Put them in there before you get the end attached, or you will have to undo the end, and it might be complicated depending on how far down the road you realize they're missing. So make sure they're both in there and the right way around, and then we'll go ahead and we'll attach this end to the legs. So let's do that real fast. So this is the part here I'm talking about, the wobbliness of the frame. We're going to push down on the corners here, make sure that it's not too wobbly. We'll loosen up the screws a little bit so that there's some movement in order to get it nice and flat. We can see here that it wobbles just very slightly from corner to corner. So we will loosen up a couple screws, push it down flat best we can, and then retighten those screws so it stays flat. So we can see here the wobble has been reduced quite a bit just by loosening the screws. We'll go a little bit further and get it as low as possible by undoing the screws, loosening them a little bit on the other side, and then pressing firmly down as we tighten it up. So in this step here, it's asking us to add the rubber feet to the bottom of the frame. And we're going to go ahead and do that, but then I will realize that in the manual, it kind of explains that it's going to be a little more difficult to rotate the frame around and work with it without picking it up. And this is just an old melamine IKEA cabinet shelf, so I'm not really too worried about scratching it up or damaging it. It's just a spare thing that I have laying around, so I'd rather have the feet off so that we can easily slide the frame around and not have to pick it up every time. So let's take those off and move to the next step. So we're just going to lay out the hardware for the next step, which is going to be the Y-axis assembly, which is where the bed moves back and forth on the frame. So let's collect all the parts for that and get them out. This is the Y-axis bag. It's got the plastic pieces in it. And from there, we will assemble these holders for the Y-axis belt and get them attached to the frame. So we can see here the Y-axis belt holder. That's going to mount to the front of the frame. And we're going to put the hardware that's needed inside of that. It gets a little bit finicky because your fingers can't fit inside the slot there. So I'm going to use the pliers that came with the Prusa to assemble it. And sometimes you'll find that the holes on the plastic pieces are a little bit tight. So what we're going to do is we're going to pre-screw them in so that they take any little plastic leftovers that are in there from printing. Makes it a little bit easier to get them in and out and get them screwed in properly. So now that we have the belt carrier assembled, we'll go ahead and attach it to the frame. We'll see a little screw hole here. This indicates the position that we should place it in on the frame. This is all noted in the assembly manual. And now we finally get to work on our first motor, the Y-axis motor, and we'll be putting that together with the plastic printed parts provided. So just make sure that when you're looking through the box, you pick up the right motor. It does say on each motor what it's for, and so does the manual. Should have it highlighted, so make sure you grab the right one. And there's a couple nuts that need to be attached to the 3D printed part so that it will attach to the frame. And then we attach this piece to the motor. Let's make sure we get it in the correct orientation as we see in the image provided in the assembly manual. So now we'll be able to attach this to the back of the frame, opposite where we attached the belt carrier. So now we're on to the bed of the printer. This is actually just a frame for the bed to sit on. It's where the rails will attach with the bearings and it will slide on those rails. So we'll get the bearings attached to the bed frame and then we'll attach the bed frame to the rails, which will be mounted to the frame that we built previously. So let's get our parts out that we need and we'll put everything together. So this bearing, it comes in a package of oil. It's pre-oiled in there, it's sealed shut. So when you open it up, you'll want a napkin or paper towel or something to kind of dry out the outside so it's not too slippery to handle. So you can see inside there, the bearing holder, you want those to sit in a specific orientation on the frame so that when they are sliding on the rails, they are sliding on those bearing surfaces and in the most efficient manner as possible. That's how you get longevity out of your bearing slides. So the bearings are just held on with these straps that are screwed down to the frame. They're a little bit finicky to get on if you put the strap on first and then try and screw the bolt through into the frame. You'll see the next one that I do, I kind of put the bolts on the strap first and then put those through into the frame. It was a little bit easier that way. And then to hold the nut still, I used the provided pliers so that it didn't spin while I was turning the bolt. So you'll see here I'm putting the bolts through the holes on the straps previous to putting the strap over the bearing and onto the frame. And then I realized I don't have enough nuts, and I checked to make sure that I'm supposed to have more nuts than this, and I grab them. So let's get the nuts attached. Okay, all the bearings are attached. Now we'll need to grab the rails, and the instructions say that we need the medium ones, so let's sort these out. We'll grab the medium ones here. And these are the ones that we're going to use. We're going to slide them through the bearings very carefully. The instructions do indicate that the bearings could knock loose some ball bearings within there, and just to be careful sliding those through. So do it delicately. And you'll want to aim as straight as possible through each bearing, just so that you're not twisting or bending anything. And these are the end caps or attachment points for the rails to get them mounted to the frame. So we'll need a lot of bolts and a lot of nuts, and they'll go on each 3D printed rail holder. So the nuts used inside of these 3D printed parts were the square nuts, and they were a little bit tight fitting in here, so I had to use an Allen key, and then I ended up tapping these on the table to get the nut inserted enough into the part so that we could line up the bolt when we attach it to the frame. And we can see here, each 3D printed part to hold the rail needed 3 bolts. So now that they're slid onto the rails, we can go ahead and attach these parts to the frame. So you'll see here that I couldn't quite get the bolts screwed into the nuts in these 3D printed parts. because I wasn't able to press the nuts far enough into the part. So now I'm using an Allen key to try and push them a little bit further and sticking the Allen key into the side hole and using a little bit of leverage to get them down. After I do that, they go ahead and they get bolted in quite easily. It's just a matter of making sure that the bolts and the hole in the 3D printed part are aligned properly. So I'd gone ahead and I had tightened all the bolts for the rail holders. And then when I read the manual, I noticed it said make sure that they're slightly loosened, because we are going to slide the bed on the rails back and forth a few times, make sure that it is riding straight and clear on both sides. Once we've done that, you can actually hear a difference in the way that it slides back and forth. So you hear it's a little bit rough, but once we slide it back and forth a few times and tighten everything up, that rough sound gets a little bit quieter and the feeling gets much smoother. So now that we've put some pressure on it and drove it back and forth quite a few times with some pressure, we can go ahead and tighten up those bolts. So here we'll just attach the belt gear onto the motor, and this is what's going to drive the belt back and forth. We attach it with a grub screw to the gear. It's pretty straightforward. There's a flat spot on the axle of the motor and a grub screw on the belt gear holder that you tighten down onto that flat spot, which holds it firmly to the axle of the motor. So these two 3D printed parts are the belt tensioning system. We're going to attach the belt to these two plastic pieces, which will be attached to the bed frame, and we will use a bolt in between the two to tighten them towards each other, which will in turn tighten the belt. So here I was just having a hard time getting the nut to seat firmly into the printed part. So I put the bolt through and used that to pull the nut back into the part and then unscrewed the bolt. So you'll see here the way that the belt attaches to the 3D printed parts is using a bolt and the belt looped around that and then pinched into the plastic part. So once we attach the 3D part with the belt pinched on it, we have to guide the belt through around to the motor, through the frame, and back around to the belt carrier on the other side, and then attach the loose end of the belt onto the other belt holder. And we will screw that into the frame and then attach the two pieces together with another bolt that will tighten them together, creating tension on the belt. So you'll see here how much of a loop I made. You'll see in a minute that I did take this back out of here because there wasn't enough slack in the belt in order to get the part attached to the bottom of the frame. So I did have to undo this, make the loop smaller, and then redo it so that the part could be attached to the frame and enough tension there to tighten them together. And this right here is where I realized there isn't enough slack in the belt to properly attach these two tensioners together. And I decide that I will take this apart and make the loop smaller. So after making the first tensioner loop smaller, I also realized that I had to go back to the first one and make that one smaller as well. So now that we've shortened up our loops on each side of the tensioner, we can attach them together and get them attached to the frame. Now the bottom screw that goes into the frame, you don't want to tighten it too much as it will slide back and forth as there's a slide hole in the plastic printed part for it to move back and forth. The tension actually comes from a bolt that attaches both plastic pieces together. And as you tighten it, it pulls them together, creating the tension. So here I'm just sliding the bed back and forth so that we can make sure that there's enough tension in the belt that it doesn't skip any teeth on the motor mount gear. And then I'll go ahead and I will tighten up the bolts attached to the bottom of the bed. So that's it for part 1 of this assembly series. We can finally dig into some gummies. Now, I don't have the original gummies because I swallowed those when I opened the box and shared them with my kids. So, I bought some new gummies to get this project done assembling it. So, I hope I see you in part 2. of the next steps for this assembly. Thanks for watching this one. I'll see you in the next one. Bye!